That probably helps a lot. Okay, I think we'll make a start. Confirm the roaming mics.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. You are very welcome. Very good evening on behalf of the Cambridge University Land Society and especially the Whitehall Group, the organisation I have the great honour and privilege of being able to chair. For those of you a little bit less familiar with who we are and what we do, we are a wonderful part of the Cambridge Alumni Network. We are 11 years old. We were founded by someone many of you know well, which is Douglas Blawston. And our job is fundamentally to bring people together within the broader built environment, but not overdo it to property people, as you can see the wonderful mix of backgrounds and a real fantastic melting pot. We have a blockbuster evening lined up, which I hope you all really enjoy. We have a topic which we really went to and fro in terms of designing it and thinking about the angle, trying not to be too negative, trying to be realistic, but also trying to stimulate wonderful engagement. So I do encourage our panelists to be as positive as possible. So we've gathered to discuss this evening a very provocative and urgent question. Britain, failed state, can it be fixed? A theme that invites critical reflection on the political, economic, institutional trajectory of the country in a time of increasing uncertainty. We are honoured to be joined by a distinguished panel of thinkers, practitioners and doers who bring deep experience and sharply honed perspectives. Before I introduce them, allow me to sort of expand a little bit on the context of the discussion which Douglas and I brought together. And we look back, obviously, particularly over the last decade, in terms of how the country has faced unusual and generational shifts and pressures that have tested resilience of its institutions and coherence of its political and even social settlement. The aftermath of Brexit continues to shape international posturing and economic performance. Hopes of a global Britain have collided with practical concerns over trade, regulatory isolation and regional destabilisation. Once a fulcrum of diplomacy and European international diplomacy, the UK is now obviously renegotiating many of its external relationships, but also the fabric of the Union. Simultaneously, security commitments have been naturally tested. We have some leading experts on military history, international affairs tonight, and obviously thinking about how we engage post-Ukraine conflict, how we look at the position within NATO, the role that's played in terms of also broader Western alliances in the face of changing US arrangements, policies and tariffs. To discuss all of that, and against this backdrop, we have a superb panel. The question, obviously, more focused on can it be fixed rather than the first part of the theme. It's not rhetorical, and I hope it's something we can really engage with. To lead this conversation, we are really fortunate to be joined by Emily Maitlis, someone who needs very little introduction to all of you here today, who will serve as our moderator. Emily is a highly respected broadcaster, formerly the BBC, and currently co-host of the News Agents podcast. Her career has been marked by fearless and forensic journalism, and her stewardship of tonight's conversation will deliver rigour and insight across our panel. Our panellists include Sam Freedman, on her right, a senior fellow with the Institute of Government and a senior advisor to the education charity ARC. Sam brings a rare insight into the machinery of Whitehall, having served as a policy advisor at the Department of Education. He's a regular commentator on governance and state capacity, and his writings explore the fragility of institutional delivery, especially in sectors like education and health. In the middle, on Sam's right, is Martin Wolf. Martin Wolf is the chief economics commentator at the Financial Times. Martin is one of the world's most respected economic analysts. In his latest book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, he argues that liberal democracies are imperiled by rising inequality, populism and the erosion of public trust. Themes that resonate powerful in this context. His reflections on Brexit, trade policy and Britain's macroeconomic missteps are especially critical tonight. And on my left, and our last panellist, is General the Lord Richards. Lord Richards is known to many of you from his time as Chief of the Defence Staff and as professional head of the Armed Forces. Lord Richards offers a strategic and military lens on Britain's role in the world, having led key operations including East Timor, Sierra Leone and Afghanistan. His perspectives bridge the operational and geopolitical. In his book, Taking Command, he reflects on leadership, global security and Britain's place in a changing world order. We are immensely proud and grateful to have you all to give over your time this evening. I really hope you enjoy the conversation. For those of you who've made time as well to join us, you're very welcome and I hope you enjoy it. For those of you online as well, I hope you find it of interest. So please join me in welcoming our moderator and panellists. Emily.
Thank you. It's lovely to see all of you here on this gloriously sunny summer evening. Just don't let the sunlit uplands stand in the way of what we're going to discuss tonight, because that title is Britain Failed State. Can it be fixed? Rather uplifting, but as Con was saying, we can approach this from really across the spectrum with this excellent panel before us. Sam's book was, I don't know if I'm going to say coincidentally, whether you've shoehorned your title into this very discussion tonight, Sam, but Sam is the author of Failed State, Why Nothing Works and How We Fix It. So before we start to fix it, let's just deconstruct why you would call us, Britain now, in 2025, a failed state. We're not Syria, we're not Somalia. Broadly, things work, we can function, we go about our lives without fear. Why are we a failed state, Sam?
So, I've worked in international development and I have worked with real failed states, and I know that we're not like those countries. But I wanted to use that phrase partly to get people's attention, but also because I wanted to point to the fact that the biggest problems we have, in my view, are to do with a crisis of governance. They're to do with the fact that our institutions don't work in the way that they should, and then that leads to all sorts of other problems with our economic system and our ability to deliver public services and so on. So I wanted to focus in on governance, and I thought that was a good sort of title for doing that. And the reason I think that they are struggling so badly, sort of three connected reasons. The first is that we are the most centralised rich country in the world. And we have become much more centralised over the last 40 years, and as a result we've destroyed a lot of the local state capacity that we had. And in other countries, regional and local state capacity is critical in providing public services. We've got rid of a lot of that. We're very dependent on central government, and yet we have a centre of that government that is extremely dysfunctional because it was never designed at all, and certainly never designed for the purpose it's now being asked to fulfil. So you have a Prime Minister who has a lot of executive authority in theory, but quite a weak operation in terms of the capacity around him in number 10, and we can see the sort of challenges that's causing at the moment. And then you combine that with the fact that we have a legislature that's very weak as well in the House of Commons, that has neither the capability nor the powers to properly scrutinise that very powerful and dysfunctional central executive. And you have a media that is increasingly, because of this centralisation, has become increasingly focused on the political and the trivial and ephemeral rather than policy or any of the sort of big issues that Parliament used to sort of discuss. That sort of combination of a highly centralised state with a dysfunctional executive, a weak scrutiny through your legislature, and a media that exacerbate all of those things makes it so hard to achieve anything else as a country, whoever is in power, although the people do matter, of course.
So if I asked you to pinpoint when you would believe that this became a failed state, would you go back 10 years, 30 years, 50 years?
Well, all of these things are trends, and they've all been there in Britain to some degree, always. We've always been more centralised than most countries because of our history and the way that the country, particularly I'm talking about England here, formed. We've always had quite a weak parliament, and we've always had a media that was more, well, certainly since the sort of 80s and 90s, more sort of muckraking than in other countries. But all of these trends have become more and more pronounced, partly because the state does so much more than it used to, because it's become a much bigger part of our lives. It spends more of our money, and it does things that it just didn't get involved in back then. There's a lot more legislation passed. It's a lot more complicated. And so these systems that sort of worked 40, 50 years ago have just over time and incrementally stopped working as well. And the trends like centralisation have been exacerbated over that period too.
So if we look at Sam to talk us through sort of failures of governance, legislature perhaps, Martin, I turn to you for the economics of it. I mean, you were writing today about the other side of the Atlantic and Trump's tariffs, and suggesting that we were looking there at an arbitrary dictatorship, something that could become an arbitrary dictatorship. By comparison, do you feel that things feel more stable here?
On the politics, I think that the answer to that has to be yes. Though I'm still expecting Nigel Farage to become Prime Minister. So if that happens, it'll probably be more fun and not quite as mad. So even under those circumstances, this is facetious because, of course, I don't take place any weight on my views on politics. But the point is, I would say politically, Britain continues to feel reasonably stable to me because, most significantly, I do think the British, I think and hope, retain what I've always thought is the single most important quality of the British, which is their sense of the ridiculous. And obviously Trump is ridiculous. Surely the British can see that. The Americans can't, which is, I lived for 10 years in America and I knew they wouldn't. So so in terms of getting into that sort of mess, I think the sense of the ridiculous captured so beautifully in Chaplin's wonderful Great Dictator is the thing I trust in most about this country.
But if you're looking...
Certainly not the idea that the politicians know what they're doing.
But if you were looking at this country economically, would you call us a failed state?
Well, that's for you to decide. And obviously I wouldn't describe it as a failed state. It would be a failing economy.
Yeah.
But I thought at this opening, because, by the way, I have an absolutely terrific presentation on this, and I'm very happy to send it to you. And I can't give it to you because it takes about 50 minutes. It gives you every number you'll need, but I'll give you 2 numbers that are really relevant, or perhaps 3 that are really relevant. So the great turning point in UK economic performance in the post-1980 period, I don't want to go back to when it really started going wrong, which was the 1870s. But no, I'm not joking, obviously. I'm absolutely serious. But we don't need to discuss that. Was around about the global financial crisis. So up to, from 1990, from 1990, so after the reforms of the Thatcher period to 2007, GDP per head in real terms, I won't go to the measurement, in this country rose at 2.5% a year. And that was just about in line with America and significantly better than any other of the major Western European countries. And we thought we'd cracked it. I was one of them. Since then, GDP per head, this is fitted trend, so 2007 to 2024 has been running at 0.6%. And the decline, which you've now worked out is 1.9 percentage points, is significantly the biggest decline in the major developed countries. And as a result of that, GDP per head in real terms in this country today is 29% lower than it would have been if the pre-crisis trend had continued. And that is a very, very, very large number. And if you want to understand why our politics are a mess, why they can't manage the public finances, why we can't easily meet the burdens of an aging society, so it's all about that number.
So we all went through the financial crash.
And it was particularly in terms of our absolute growth performance over the last, since 2007, has not been, I can go through every number, been significantly worse than our European peers.
So just
it's roughly in line, but it's much, much lower than it was before when we thought we were doing well. And because we were poorer than those countries in 2007, it means that the catch-up that we were enjoying stopped. And those are the characteristics of the British economy.
So just to get into that, is that because of the policies that governments pursued during and after the financial crash? Is it directly related to policy decisions taken in government?
I think that's a part of it, but a relatively small part.
Okay.
My own view is that the economy, in fact, in 2007 was significantly weaker than we believed it was. And to put it very, very crudely, because it might drive some people mad, the Thatcher Revolution failed. I didn't believe that at the time. It didn't transform the economy in a durable way. and the weaknesses from the past remained, and we didn't, and we ended up at the end of this earlier period, the financial sector on which we depended very, very heavily didn't continue to perform so well for obvious reasons. The fact that the investment rate and the savings rate in the country was fantastically low continued to be very burdensome. We never solved that. And we have just about the biggest regional problems biggest degree of regional inequality of the larger Western countries. And we're sort of in line with Italy, actually a bit worse. And that's to do with the fact that we never really solved the problem created by deindustrialization in large parts of our country. And there's a whole history behind that. So I wouldn't say we are in any way strikingly worse than France or Italy or Germany now than it appeared to be before. But our performance has been signally mediocre. And I think it reflects structural things more than anything else. But I remain of the view that there was a huge argument about this time that the fiscal policies of the Osborne chancellorship were a significantly mistimed mistake, and it might, stress might, have made a not a small difference in destroying the animal spirits of the private sector. But that's hypothetical. I mean, we definitely don't know that's the case. What we do know is that the long-term post-crisis performance of the economy, though not dramatically worse than France, Italy, countries like that, or even Germany more recently, is nowhere near where it was before the financial crisis, and we remain basically poorer.
Yeah. Lord Richards, if we come to you for an overview of where we are militarily, former Chief of the Defence Staff and author of The Retreat from Strategy, we know that our armed forces have shrunk significantly over decades, but it does feel as if there is a new injection for rather urgent reasons into the economics of the military, into defence spending. Do you feel that this is one area where the government is sort of catching up?
Yes, but to discuss it, I'd quickly like to nip back to Sam's definition of a failed state, because I think that is at the core of why we've gone wrong. You're looking for clear policy, maybe. I'm looking for something called strategy. And I'm afraid that probably since the end of the Cold War, give or take, we haven't quite understood what we are as a nation. What is it we wish to achieve? And the latest effort, the Strategic Defence Review, in a way should not have been produced until after the strategy review that we are expecting in the next week or two, because that should have told us what it is that we wish our country to be. And only when you know that, a sort of direction of travel, Laurie, Freedman and I don't always agree on this, but something that I think traditionally might have been called a grand strategy. What is it that we expect and want of our nation that we can all then get behind? Policy makers all understand it. Military men who are designing armed forces get behind it. We've got an idea of the direction of travel and what's required. Our economists understand it and all those sort of things. So for me, that is a very important guiding sense of direction. We don't have that. I don't think we probably understood it for a long time. To give you an idea, when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, you will remember we had a lot of talk about global Britain. Well, funny enough, Martin and I were talking before this started, and we're agreed, and I think it's been pretty obvious for a long time, that we are a nation of straitened times, and the economy is central to this, and that we are at best a regional power. The idea that we've got some residual global role, and right as we speak, we've got what's euphemistically known as the Carrier Strike Group, sailing towards the South China Sea to do whatever it's going to do to sort of confront freedom of navigation issues with China potentially, is perhaps a result of decisions taken during Boris Johnson's time, because these things take a long time. I suspect, I don't know, I suspect today's government would have said that's a little bit unnecessarily ambitious. Let's constrain ourselves to the Euro-Atlantic area and to NATO, and focus on having probably quite an influence over NATO. We've got residual respect and perhaps beyond that which we deserve in some respects, and there's a real role there for Britain, and it's sort of, depending on one's view of where we're going to go with economically, it's sort of deliverable. So I think it's a variation on Sam's theme. I mean, the National Security Council, which is supposed to perhaps come up with this stuff, I don't know if that was one of your things you were thinking about, but it's never really lived up to its expectations, although David Cameron was absolutely right to design it.
The phrase that we always used to use was we punch above our weight. I mean, do you think there's a bit of sort of body dysmorphia going on there? or do you think, when you say we haven't worked out our strategy, what, in your head, is there a very clear sort of shape of what we could be?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I should just say, as a sort of the definition of failed state, I think we're talking quite a nuanced definition here. And it's really about inability to govern and in this case strategize, I suppose. But having messed around in a few failed states, I can assure you, as we all know, we are not a failed state in the way East Timor, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan were when I went there. So I think we've got to keep a sense of perspective about it. And I know you didn't mean that, by the way, Sam, you made that very clear. But, keeping a sense of perspective about it, we are still quite a rich nation. And properly channeled, we can make a significant difference militarily within an alliance, and I emphasise within an alliance such as NATO. And I think that's absolutely the right place for us. And I'd say my good friend, and others here will know him, George Robertson, has come up with a pretty workmanlike effort in that respect. The problem, and it all comes back, I remember making a speech in the House of Lords not a year or so ago when I emphasised in the case of defence that it was all about growing the economy, stupid. And people looked at me as if, someone said, are you a Trussite? And I said, no, what Liz Truss was advocating was pretty obvious to any of us here. And she just had picked up on the theme, and the current government are rightly doing the same thing again. But assuming a certain growth rate, and George Robertson has made it clear, although it's an input figure, that to achieve that which is in the strategic defence review will require a spending of around 3% of GDP by 2034. I mean, that, I think, is going to be quite a stretch.
On defence.
On defence, in order to, going back to your question, to deliver that which is in the SDR. And I have to say, not much of it is sort of itemised, so no one quite knows when it's got to arrive and how they're paying for it at the moment.
Yeah.
It's classic Sam government.
I should just say, we are going to leave some time for questions, so please come into the conversation with us later. And I don't want you to feel that this is siloed, so please feel free to pick up on each other's points. I mean, it is interesting, isn't it, that as we speak, we understand that I think Scott Besant and Howard Lutnick are in London using our sort of neutral position to try and work out a solution to the China-US tariffs problem. I mean, do you think we have, maybe this is to you, Martin, do you think we have an important role in sort of economic diplomacy at this point?
That's a very interesting question. I have to say my immediate reaction, but then I am a journalist and old and cynical, is, my God, they must really be in trouble if that's what they're doing. However, it is also consistent. I don't want to advance my theories of how the US administration is working. Obviously, I follow it fairly closely with my colleagues. Is that these people have obviously been instructed by the president to find a deal with China that will work. That's sensationally encouraging to me, because a full-blown trade war between the two world's superpowers is not a good idea, and very few of us will find it very comfortable to be in the crossfire. And when I say very few, I mean nobody will. So if it is true they are asking the British advice in this, that is itself very encouraging. Whether there is anybody in the British government now in a position to give good advice on trade policy is, in my view, a bit questionable.
You don't think there is?
Well, the problem is, well, first of all, our biggest trade policy decision in the last 40 years was leaving the EU, which as a trade policy decision was not the brightest thing we've ever done. And that's not the fault of the present government. But they then had to put together a new trade policy machine from scratch. So it's rather young. And the level of expertise that the British trade policy, started working on this in the 70s, they were a really impressive group of people, and I don't know who, I don't actually, which is extraordinary, I don't really know who they would be getting the advice from. And I certainly don't know of any minister who's really expert here. So I'm very happy that they think that Britain is a sensible source of advice. I'm very hopeful that it will be a useful source of advice. But when I look at actual trade policy that Britain has been conducting post-Brexit, it doesn't seem to me spectacularly impressive, though I'm very pleased that we finally put together a trade deal with India, which of course will have no significant effect on our economy. But
really not? I mean,
so,
if you
no,
looked at it in
the
10
estimates
years
are
or-
0.1% of GDP or
Now,
so.
isn't it?
No, now it's will be nothing. We really don't know what that will do to our economy. The most important trading relations I don't want to get into that, but that we have and will have for our generation is going to be Europe. It's just inescapable, because one of the great findings of international economics is, surprise, surprise, countries tend to do most of their trade with their neighbours, which is why the biggest trading partner of the United States is Canada, the country they're about to conquer. So India is a nice to have, and China will be too, but in the end, our trade policy, obviously this is quite a separate subject, needs to focus on improving our trade relations with the EU, because that's going to be the biggest bang for that particular buck, because it's the most important trading partner by far that we have, and that is likely to continue. But coming back to your question, I think it has been true, and I follow this quite closely, and many people here will have been involved in this, that the Americans have frequently come to us for advice on international economic policy because they trust us. And I imagine, even with this administration, they probably still trust us more than they trust anybody else. And that is a very important asset. And it remains an important asset. And that we've had governments, I mean, for instance, the Stern Review, the Africa Review that were done by, particularly the Stern Review in the first decade of this century, was enormously influential, because there are branches of the British government which are, or have been, the ones I know about in economic policy, very respected around the world, but Brexit hasn't helped.
We will come back to
It's a
EU
different
relations
subject.
and Brexit, but Sam, I mean, you talked about the sort of weakness of the legislature. I'm wondering whether there is a concern that I mean, to Martin's point about the British having a very fine sense of the ridiculous, do we do ourselves down? I mean, if any of you have seen the film In the Loop, it portrays this wonderful sort of half side, the sort of the transatlantic, where all the British politicians are sort of hapless and slightly lonely, and all the American politicians are very glamorous and earn a lot more money. And I wonder whether you think that we sort of fall into the trap of thinking we're just not very good at this because we're just a bit more modest in our outlook.
I think the related problem is that we're obsessed with our past, and we're obsessed with our traditions, and there is a very high bar to changing anything about our political system or the way things work, even when there's very strong evidence it's not the right thing to do. I mean, they're still fighting to get the hereditaries out of the Lords. That's taking forever. So yes, I think that that if you look at the sort of intake of MPs that have come in under the Labour government, it's not that there's not talent in that group. On all sides, there is talent, but they are not using it. They're not asked to use it in a way that is useful to scrutinising legislation or to advancing the cause of any particular policy issue. So what you get is people who either you want to be a minister because that's the way you might have some kind of influence on what happens, or you get really bored. And if you don't get the chance to be a minister, people just leave. And we're seeing this happen more and more and more, that people stay in Parliament from, even if they can hold their seat, they give up their seat because the job is just not satisfying. It is now a profession for people in a way that it didn't used to be. It used to be a job people sort of did a bit part-time alongside another job.
So
it's
would
now
it be
a profession
better?
for people.
I mean, that's a bigger question, isn't it? But obviously there was a lot of pushback of the idea of MPs having two jobs. But what you seem to be suggesting is maybe if you had a talent or an interest or a speciality and you came to the Commons part-time, that would actually be more beneficial for everyone.
I think it's a good thing that it's become a profession, and it's necessary because, as I say, the state is so much more complicated now. You couldn't get away with the way that we used to run Parliament in terms of the amount of work it did compared to what it needs to do now. The problem is they want to be professionals, but they're not given anything to do unless they get to be ministers. They're given fake jobs, they're given non-jobs. The select committee system has some ability to influence policy, but they have very limited powers compared to similar sort of systems in other countries. They can't subpoena people, they can't call for debates in Parliament, etc., etc. So it's just not an exciting... People talk about the pay of MPs. I think you could get really good people to do it on the pay. Yes, you could put the pay up, but I don't think the pay is the main issue. It's the job that's the issue.
So when you look at, say, private members' bills, like the assisted dying bill, for example, or Kim Leadbeater. I mean, does that strike you as the sort of thing we should encourage, you'd want to see more of? You'd want to see individual MPs who feel very strongly about particular issues able to get something to the floor and say, let's have a debate, let's get this out, because that's quite unusual.
I think you should have a lot more power for backbench MPs to dictate the time of the Commons and what it's talking about. For instance, when the government now, this is a fairly recent innovation in the last few decades, the government decides how much time you get to debate at the beginning, before the debate even starts. It says there's a programme motion, you get 2 days to talk about this. So really important legislation like the Rwanda legislation, that was a big deal, deporting people to an unsafe country, was given a day for third reading for committee stage and third reading in the Commons. There's no time to discuss anything, and it's just cut off, so there's no chance to talk about amendments. I don't think the private members bill model is a particularly good model for introducing legislation, and I think the assisted dying bill has got into trouble because of the way it's sort of the government are trying to support a private member to do it, which means it hasn't had the proper resource behind it. But I definitely think they should be able to. It shouldn't only be the government that can decide what the House of Commons talks about, except for the 20 days the opposition get.
With your peer hat on, Lord Richard, does it work for you? I mean, do you find the Lords to be a place where the right sort of business gets done?
As a complete novice and never expecting to go near the House of Lords, but it came up with the rations, as we say in the army, I ended it very sceptical. Actually, I think, notwithstanding what Sam has said, that I'm quite defensive of the House of Lords. They, unlike often happens in the Commons, as I understand, I've got a number of friends in the Commons, take a lot of trouble scrutinising bills in a way that where a more political House of Commons often hasn't got the time or resources to do. So I would say that we're quite well served, and it's quite a cheap second chamber, a revising chamber. But of course it doesn't have the power and influence that the Senate does in America. I mean, if I may, just going back to your absolutely fascinating question, in which you inferred that the US political system somehow worked better. whatever. All I would say is, as a strategist, that their record in the last 30 years has been pretty poor. I can't think of a war that they've succeeded in, for example, and to some extent we've been caught up in all those. One reason I think our judgment often is flawed at the very top level, and I'm talking cabinet level, and certainly, sort of senior minister level, is that we make assumptions, and those politicians, I would love to call them statesmen, but I don't see many, if any, those politicians have an assumption about their own brilliance and ability to decide great things with no training or background whatsoever. So you can find yourself in a meeting with someone who a year ago was a teacher or whatever, very respectable profession, who's suddenly being asked to decide on whether we should go to war. And they have no background or understanding in it because they've chosen often not to be educated, but also the system fails them in that they don't attempt to train them. So there's a combination of reasons there that make it very, very difficult for them to achieve what we expect of them.
So is the hubris that they don't listen? I mean, do you think? I mean, they are. I guess they'd argue are elected representatives. So the decision of war has to come from them rather than the head of the armed forces or whatever. But what are you saying? I mean, they don't listen to expertise, or they are too ambitious, or what is
it's not a matter of listening to expertise. I mean, someone like me would go to the National Security Council and do our best to advise on a future course of action in wherever it might be. No, it's not that I'm getting at all. It's more that the system, encouraged by the individuals who quite naturally in a way don't want to be exposed, doesn't help our leaders, I wish as I said, we could call them statesmen, but our political leaders who are charged with great decisions of state to be, in my area, to be trained. They may have done economics at Cambridge or whatever, but very, very few of them have any preparation for the big decisions that I'm talking about in my sort of sphere of expertise. I mean, Margaret Thatcher, when she was Prime Minister, because often when I give talks on statecraft and statesmen, but rhetorically I would say to the audience, so when was our last statesman in number 10 Downing Street? And you can see them all sort of scratching their head. Most, notwithstanding whatever their political sort of prejudice might be, most sort of think somehow Margaret Thatcher probably was a statesman. Some would argue that Tony Blair even was. But
so what do you think that's based on? Sorry, is it about sort of rhetorical flourish? Is it about determination? Is it about simplicity of message? Or is it about the size of your majority and the ability to take people with you? I mean, how would you, because you're talking about leadership. I mean, what we've got onto is leadership, right, which is a pretty big part of this whole thing,
I don't think it's just about leadership. It's about being a statesman with all the things that we could characterize that by, understanding statecraft, thinking non-politically for what is right for the country within the resources we've got. It's aligning ends, ways and means. We've got great ends and we can find ways with allies, but we don't have the means. What is the point of that strategy, for example? And that you see through government, I think, all the time, failed ambition because we haven't got the money to deliver on it.
Let me bring in Martin, because you sort of raised an eyebrow at that point, Martin, and I'm wondering who you would see as a statesman or woman. I mean, would you say Gordon Brown's role in the sort of post-financial crash settlement was? I mean, that was global statesmanship, wasn't it? Would you call Tony Blair a statesman? Would you call Keir Starmer now a statesman?
It's not a word I think about very much. In my line of business, there aren't any. So the economic policy, but I think we have had politicians who have made quite bold and important decisions over the last half century, which have worked out to some degree, and a lot of them, and you, I think, got this very well, which I do think is a quality of the British system, is its capacity to cope with actual crisis.
Yeah.
So in my area, as you obviously said, the key crisis of the last 25 years, I think the pandemic is another one, but that's a whole lot of technical questions there, which I don't want to get into now. But was the financial crisis, and after some humming and hawing, there were some delays. The British machine worked really well. And it worked very well because of the concentration of power. The Treasury is really good at this. There's no question that it's really good at managed crises, financial crises, because it's had a lot of practice, really a lot of practice, and the power is very focused. And in a financial crisis, it has to be focused. So the machine worked really well. And we had a chancellor, or a prime minister, former chancellor, who liked playing that role. And the Americans in particular, particularly with that administration, Obama's administration, were very happy to follow him. And well, it actually started under George W., but in the meeting of the G20, basically orchestrating this around the G20, which started under George W., but then we had the London meeting, which was the crucial meeting, in which really the agenda was set. And they did play. So in a crisis, I think the British machine works very, very well in the economic areas I know about.
Could we have gone down a TARP route, as Obama did, a massive programme of expenditure? I mean,
well, we basically did.
We did.
Well, we rescued the banks that had to be rescued,
but not in policy terms. I mean, we didn't we didn't embark on sort of big spending on infrastructure projects. And
well, there are two questions. The first is, how well did we handle the collapse of our banks? And I think the answer to that, we were the first, and we did it. Really were the first, I think. And we did it pretty ruthlessly. Of course, we should never have been in that situation. I mean, the state financial regulation before the crisis was a total scandal. And what was allowed to happen, particularly in Royal Bank of Scotland, to some extent also Lloyd's, but the Royal Bank of Scotland and Goodwin was completely out of control. It's a total failure, colossal failure.
Fred Goodwin.
Fred Goodwin, sorry. So the regulation, so it shouldn't have happened when we made mistakes about the way we approached the whole competition issue for London against New York. So it's one of those classic cases. I think strategically it was a disaster, and tactically it was absolutely brilliant. We're very, very good at handling crises, some of which were unnecessary. Then there was the question of, what do you do after the crisis to regenerate the economy? And there was a decision effectively taken, and I know all the people involved. What we've got at the end of this is a banking system that is in terrible trouble that has to be healed. I was involved in that personally because I was in the Independent Commission of Banking. That worked debatably, but not too terribly. We have a fiscal crisis, which is the overwhelming immediate problem, and we have to deal with that because it's terribly important. Otherwise, we become Greece, which I think was ridiculous, but that was a debate. And we have a fundamental economic strategy problem because what we thought was working didn't. And we never addressed that last question at all.
Yeah.
And we haven't since. And actually, it's incredibly difficult. We haven't discussed that, why it's so difficult. All the choices are hard. But I would say, if I think back on the financial crisis for Britain, which shouldn't have been as bad as it was. That was bad elsewhere too. We handled the crisis itself really, really well. And the post-crisis period was not insane, but far too short-termist and far too political, because the chancellor of the day wanted to present this for political reasons, as essentially a fiscal problem rather than essentially a regulatory problem, and the problem that our entire strategy based on the financial sector had proven a mistake, so we had to change it. And that never happened. We never had a discussion, okay, so what does the financial crisis mean for the future of the British economy? And some of the problems that I think we have now are partly because that's not a discussion we want to have, because we're really bad at it.
Let us fast forward to today and pick up on a phrase Martin used, Sam, unnecessary crisis. Perhaps you put Brexit into that box.
Unnecessarily severe. We were going to have a crisis, but we were terribly exposed.
On the financial crash.
I mean, unbelievably exposed.
If you look at where we are, Sam, now in terms of relations with Europe, and to go back to Martin's point, that there is a point of trading with your neighbours, it is just much, much simpler. Where do you think, how hamstrung do you think the government is now between what it wants to do and what it feels able to do?
Very. I mean, I think 94% of Labour MPs voted Remain. Nearly everybody in the Labour Party, not everybody, but nearly everybody thinks it was a mistake. And if they could click their fingers and undo it, they would. But they can't. And there's sort of two reasons why they can't. The first is if you ask people in focus groups, do polls, did Brexit work? They'll say, the majority will say no, it didn't. The majority would say they would rejoin. But if you ask them, okay, and would you be willing to go through another referendum and another 2 years of arguing about it? They were, no. We don't want to go back there. It's a horrible time. We got nothing done for a very long time. It was completely,
it was worse than nothing done, wasn't it?
Negative.
It was properly.
It was a huge opportunity cost. In terms of governance. So people don't, and I think reasonably don't want to go back there, and I don't think the government wants to go back there. But there's an even more fundamental issue, which is, the leading party in the polls right now is Reform, who are absolutely implacably opposed to ever going near the European Union, and are certainly having a far more aggressive deal than we have now. And whilst it's not a settled question in British politics, why on earth would the EU want to go back to that question? It would be crazy to go back to that question from their point of view, because we haven't decided what we want to do yet. If people are still willing to vote for a government, or potentially vote for a government who are profoundly anti-EU, there's no point trying to create new deals of that kind of scale. So I think that it is still possible that one day it will happen, but it's going to be a very, very long time, and it has to become a settled issue in British politics first, and that is going to take.
Yeah, I remember being with a sort of bunch of EU ambassadors who just thought there was something hilarious about the word rejoin.
Yes.
there is no verb
no
to
rejoin,
rejoin.
right. Yeah.
An economic union. So let us then. I mean, you've brought us, I guess, to Reform. How much do you think that Reform is a product of what we are all talking about now, which is this use of the word failure, this use of the idea of a failed state, this idea that things that people thought they were getting haven't happened, or thought they were voting for haven't happened, or the backlash from the financial crash was profound. I mean, not just economically, but sort of culturally, in terms of how people felt the government was prioritising banks over houses, for example. I mean, does that tell the whole story of Reform, do you think?
I think the experience of failure and the frustration with politicians is a big part of it. It's not the only part of the story. I think there's a big element of sticking it up to people who look down their noses at you, and a sense of giving sort of the people in charge a kicking more generally. But if you do focus groups with sort of Reform voters or potential Reform voters, particularly potential Reform voters, so not people who sort of love Nigel Farage, but people who are sort of thinking about voting Reform, we've moved from a position where people would be hostile to the government, to sort of conventional politicians, and say so they're all in it for themselves, and they lie a lot, and they've always said that. But it's now moved to sort of almost a genuine hatred. These people are useless. They do not know what they're doing. I lent my vote to Labour last year. They've not been any better. It's a disaster. So it's almost like there's nothing to lose, and of course there is a lot to lose.
Can I ask whether
that's the emotion that's driving a lot of this.
Is that a democratic confidence? Is that what happens in a sophisticated democracy where people do understand and they do feel they've got a right and they can start demanding to see sort of results from their vote? I mean, do you think, is that...
Well, I think you're seeing it in every country, every kind of developed country in Europe and America, around the world. You're seeing the centre-right has sort of just collapsed. The radical right, if that's what you want to call them, have taken their place in many countries. And they've been able to do that by creating an alliance between extremely rich people and dispossessed people who are furious at what looks like a very long train of incompetence, going back in particular to the financial crisis, going back to the surge of immigration, particularly into Europe since the Syrian civil war. And that has driven this sort of enormous anger that's powered the radical right to sort of sweep past the centre-right. And then you've got a sort of centre-left that's now defending against that and increasingly nervous and lacking in confidence in its own arguments because they're terrified of losing. Losing has now become existential. And that is making the centre-left or the centre increasingly defensive and scared of making its own arguments. So it's a bad dynamic, but it has been driven, not just in this country, but by a sense of failure from mainstream parties and institutions, certainly.
I'll bring you in a second, Martin. I just want, on this point, Lord Richards, the sort of the clear water that Keir Starmer has found with Nigel Farage actually is over defence policy. And he keeps on aligning Farage as a sort of fan of Putin and somebody who's soft on Russia, who doesn't want to see Ukraine helped or Russia defeated. I mean, do you feel that is somewhere? Do you think that the sort of... how do you view the sort of position of defence spending in the reform voter?
Well, I think they're pretty immature, they're thinking on that. I listened to Nigel Farage defend that accusation that he was sort of soft on Russia. I think in his defence, and I don't know him from Adam, but it's the same instinct that I pick up from friends of mine in America who aren't necessarily sort of pro-Trump, but all are worried about having a very unstable, destabilizing war in Eastern Europe and want to draw a line under it. And I think that's really, as I understand it, where President Trump is coming from. I think we should take him at face value when he says that he doesn't want to see any more people die. And if they're not prepared to put a lot more into the Ukraine war, I'm afraid a lot more people will die. And as a moral soldier, I rather resent asking people to fight wars on our behalf, depending on one's analysis, but not giving them the means to win. A lot of people are going to die. And so I think there's a lot of that, as I understand it, in Nigel Farage's position on Ukraine. And it's something...
So you're quite sympathetic to that?
As a soldier who vowed many, many years ago to call out poor military strategy, what I see in Ukraine is poor military strategy. There may be some people in this room who think Ukraine is going to kick Russia out of the 4 oblasts in Crimea. I'm not one of them.
What should we do?
Well, I would like to draw a line under the war as soon as possible. I'd like to see Ukraine, and here we have a problem because Russia will do everything it can to prevent this happening. I would reinforce Ukraine and broadly the tactics that they're employing, which are very defensive, quite old-fashioned, to make sure that Russia can't take any more terrain other than that which is agreed in some peace treaty that Russia can keep. And then I would
And as a former soldier, you wouldn't worry about Russian expansion further into Europe?
I mean, we're getting into controversial stuff here, and I'm only one man's view, but I have studied it quite a lot, and I used to run the Soviet studies bit in the staff college many, many years ago, so I've got a bit of history in it. There is no great history of Russian adventurism, I would say, or Soviet adventurism, going way back, well before the Soviet Union's time. I'm thinking of the Berlin blockade, the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think as long as NATO is solid in its defence of NATO countries and NATO terrain, I don't personally see what point there would be in Moscow attempting in some physical sense to attack the Baltic states. The risks, for example, the risks of that going wrong are considerable. And rightly so, Russia would calculate that they just don't know what NATO would do, but we better not bank on them not doing something. So just logically, I don't see it happening in that way. I'm not saying there won't be a lot of disruption by what people call the sort of grey area, hybrid wars and all that sort of thing. But Russia and more recently the Soviet Union, and then again Russia, have been doing that since time immemorial, as we do, by the way, and we shouldn't be worried or too concerned about it. We just got to be able to make sure that they understand we're going to be doing the same thing, which they'll find equally uncomfortable. So strategically, I think the sooner we draw a line under this war, or make up our minds to give Ukraine what it needs to win, but not doing that is the worst of all worlds, and a lot of people will be dying for no great gain.
I'm going to give you, Martin, the last word before we open it up to audience questions. You want to come in?
I just want to make a fairly simple point, which I think affects everything we've been talking about, and is what I see as the historical context and the political context from the economic point of view. So it's the core of my book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. The deal of modernity, in my view, has been the emergence of democracy. I'm going to all of that, let's cover this, has been that you live in an economy in which you have essentially a positive sum political system. And by a positive sum, I mean you're in a society in which everybody, or almost everybody, has a reasonably good reason to expect that their standards of living will improve over time, steadily, and that what they see as the essential public services are delivered. And that, of course, gets more difficult over time because of the changes of the demography of our societies. There are a lot more old people, like some of them in this room. Now, so far as we know, in the last 150 odd years, and the figures aren't perfect, we have never had a period with as long a period of essentially stagnant real GDP per head as now, and this is happening at a time when demography is decisively against us more than ever before. Hitherto, up to now, actually, up to this last 2025, demography has been in our favor, and we also don't want more immigrants. And that means that all politics is poison, because it's about making impossible choices in which will dissatisfy the majority of the electorate. And so we've seen a beautiful example of this winter fuel nonsense, right? It's a beautiful example. And the decisions that are made in that context are, in my view, consistently irrational. And none of them deal with the real problems, which is how do we get growth? That's the failed state. Because if we don't get growth back, this system will, in my view, not be stable. And America got into the same position unnecessarily because inequality became so severe, in my view. That's a whole other subject. But in Britain, if we don't solve the stagnation problem, and we won't solve our political problem, and solving the stagnation problem involves decisions that mean there will be a large amount of losers now. And the most obvious reason for that, I will just give this one number, is we have the lowest investment rate in the developed world. You're not going to accelerate our growth without raising the investment rate. What happens if you want to raise investment is consumption has to shrink. Good luck with that. So I feel really sorry for Rachel Reeves and Starmer. And I see why Farage might become Prime Minister, but does he have an idea of what to do? Of course he does, not the faintest idea. That's a genuine, this is why I really want, this is not a failed state. This is a major long-term crisis. And if we don't address that successfully, We are in serious
So,
trouble.
so when Starmer says we are all about growth, this government's all about growth, what is the thing that he should have done or should be doing? That
Well,
hasn't-
the
that he
trouble
hasn't?
is, I've suggested lots of things that might improve it at the margin. The planning reform they talked about is genuinely important. I think the pension reforms they're talking about are important. The Oxford-Cambridge ARC, what's it called, an ARC? I can't remember, is potentially important. There are a few other areas which are quite important. Bringing in lots and lots of highly skilled people is really important. If you did all these things ruthlessly and remorselessly, it might make a few percentage points a year difference, and that will be good over time. But there will be a longish period while you're doing this that nobody will feel anything. That's what this is going to be like. And we can't be honest about this. The real problem is that our problem is much bigger than most of us imagined 20 years ago.
And if I may, this is a grand strategic issue, going back to my talk of grand strategies.
Was it a general who said, it's not about strategy, it's about logistics? In other words.
That was Bradley after the Second World War, paraphrasing a First World War general, and he said ruefully, it's all about logistics. But also Sun Tzu, well, I'm quoting, he famously said that strategy without tactics is the slowest route to success, but tactics without strategy is merely the noise before failure or defeat in the military context. And that's exactly what, I may say, I think Martin's just said.
Let us open it up to some questions, and you can take us wherever we haven't yet been. Yes, one. We've got a couple of mics. Two.
Oh, it's either.
Sir. Let's see how many mics we've got. Maybe we'll take a few at a time.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. Mark Preston, from Chief Executive of Grosvenor, just to give you a perspective of where I'm coming from. I think looking at this question from a business perspective, I can think of four things that combine to make a failed state a reasonable choice of words, and then one suggestion as to how it can be fixed. And I'm not sure who's going to ask that question, or I suspect Lord Richards might be the best place to answer it. Strategy and a lack of it. Business craves certainty and hates uncertainty. And if strategy keeps changing every 5 minutes, one can't be surprised to find, to Martin's point, that businesses won't invest. And they'll continue to not invest unless there's some consistency about strategy. Secondly, taking responsibility. And here I'm probably talking more about the civil service, actually, than the politicians. But dealing with government departments as a business, the lack of people prepared to take responsibility, take decisions, and stand up to those decisions and not cover their backs by constantly going back and more consulting and wasting time, and by the way, wasting taxpayers' money on further reports and further consultations. This is a British disease. Thirdly, being prepared to take risk, clearly linked to taking responsibility, but I suspect what Martin might have been referring to when he was talking about the loss of release of animal spirits. There's something about, again, the British disease, which is what might go wrong, rather than the American way, which is how are we going to make sure this is going to grow. And I can think of countless examples of where the government, particularly since that Osborne period, is desperately trying to prevent the next global financial crisis, and in doing so, hampering our ability to grow.
Great.
It's that clear. So, and then the answer in terms of can it be fixed, surely, is leadership.
Right. Okay. Hold that thought, and we'll just get one more question to you, sir. Yep. If you've got the mic there, great.
Ivor?
Can we just get the mic in front for 1 second?
Yes. I'm a Crewe ex-academic. My question is directed to Sam and is prompted by a remark he made right at the beginning of our discussion, namely that part of the failure, or cause of the failure of the British state is that it's over-centralised, and he made a very good case for that in his book. My question is, in view of the poor performance of both the Scottish and Welsh governments in the areas of health, education, poverty, and social pathology, does he think there is a right form of decentralisation,
Great.
which we've not yet found?
Excellent. And could you just pass the mic forward to Lord Turnbull? Yeah, just perfect.
Lord Turnbull, now I just like the way in which it's been advertised as or asserted that Britain is a failed state. And I think this vocabulary is flawed, and it's useful to sell books, but there's also a missing question mark over failed state. And it fails to recognise two completely different categories. Let's call it there's the West, based on democracy and those sparse important values: rule of law, fairness, rights of the individual, probity in public finance, independence of the judiciary. And there's another category, those states which make no attempt to adhere to any of these values. Now, what are the characteristics of those states? The top is autocracy. The leadership doesn't submit itself to elections, or they rig them, or they ignore the outcomes. But there's never been any doubt in the UK that those who lose elections leave the stage. In the failed states, the politicians, the military, and the security are basically the same people. Public opinion is suppressed. There's heavy surveillance, physical and electronic, control over the media, and widespread dissemination of fake news, and citizens are intimidated by acts of vengeance. And there's a captured judiciary, which is unwilling to challenge the leadership, whereas we in the UK have got one of the best qualified, most experienced Supreme Courts in the world. Now, what's the first cousin to autocracy? It's kleptocracy. The regime aims to build its own wealth and income, and it does not respect private property and promote fair markets. When our politicians leave the stage, they do not take with them huge wealth and properties and bank accounts. Now, the key difference. Sorry, was that?
A jet. £400 million jumbo jet. Or not jet, not jumbo, but a jet.
Sorry, I'm talking about the UK here. The key difference between the two is one seeks to improve the welfare of the citizens. The preamble of the US Constitution talks about the duty to promote the general welfare, and the other seeks to promote the power and wealth of a leadership group.
Okay.
And I think these are the true failed states. I recommend Anne Applebaum's book. Now, it is true that the UK, in common with many democracies, has many challenges, but that doesn't constitute, in my view, being a failing state. Worryingly, the US, despite its much faulted constitution, shows some signs of flirting with the characteristics of a failed state. A captured judiciary, challenging the results of elections, use of state power, e.g. bullying of Harvard. Now, a failed state is not necessarily incompetent, but China, it turns out to be a very efficient failed state. So I think we want a different vocabulary.
Okay. Let's throw...
Can I just finish my...
Let's throw it back to the panel and just allow for a few more questions. So let us pick up, if we can, with Mark's point, first of all, which is, do we go about things the wrong way for businesses, whether it's about taking responsibility, about showing leadership, about showing consistency?
Well, I think it was broader than just business that you were getting at, although maybe that was at the heart of it. No, well, I'm with you. This is why and I'm sorry to overflog the term, why a national strategy, for want of a better term, is so important. It doesn't have to be a big country that has a consensus on the direction of travel. I mean, an obvious one, and it goes back to some degree to what Lord Turnbull has just said, without wishing to disagree with him. When you look at China, President Xi and his cohort have been involved in strategizing since they were young members of the Communist Party, and they've worked their way through it, and now he's the president of China, and the One Belt, One Road initiative is their grand strategy, for want of a better example, and it sort of works, notwithstanding the weaknesses that it has, if you like, at the tactical level, and I'm sure there are all sorts of longer term and potential flaws in the system, but compared with our growth rate, theirs looks pretty impressive, and even though there are obviously some bumps in the road ahead. So when I look at why do some countries succeed, and way beyond just the military sphere, that's something that I always look at. It could be Singapore. There you've got a country which is a very little country, but there's an absolute consensus about what its place is in the world and where it ought to go, and it's led by some very capable people who, interestingly, when they go into politics, become very well paid, going back to your point a minute ago. So, and there's a deal. You come into public life, we'll look after you, and it's not corrupt either. Funny enough, you might say, well, where are other ones? Because there aren't many. Well, funny enough, I think Switzerland. Not a country that you'd immediately associate with an understanding of where it wants to be in the world, but there is a consensus amongst the Swiss what they do and what they don't do. And so you could say that Switzerland has a grand strategic vision that drives their decision making. And that, I think, is what we lack. And we need to understand that there could then be a consensus amongst the political parties about military issues, about our place in the world, and what we need to do to mend some of the things that we've heard so clearly from both Sam and Martin. That would be an immediate response. But you've got to train people in that too.
Sam, will you answer Ivor's question about the over-centralisation of government and what that means, I guess, for devolution, in a sense, whether, given, you pointed to education and health as sort of obvious failures in the Welsh and Scottish governments, is there a message here that you would?
Firstly, great honour to be asked a question by the person who wrote Blunders of Our Government, which is one of my inspirations for what I've been writing. I think there's two parts to the answer to that question. The first is decentralisation in an English context does not look the same as devolution to Scotland and Wales. That involved devolving power to set standards and to have a different strategy about education and health. And I would certainly argue in education, which I know best, both Scotland and Wales chose a much worse strategy and have set lower standards than we did in England, and that's why it's not been successful. But you wouldn't be doing that with Greater Manchester or with the West of England or so on. You'd be asking them to do a much more operational role around the delivery of services and the sort of oversight of local economies. So I think it's a very different in terms of what you're trying to achieve. That said, if you do decentralise, you will have failure. Absolutely, you will have failure. You will have, Andrea Jenkins is now the mayor of Greater Lincolnshire. I don't think that's going to go very well. But that's still worth doing, firstly because you'll also get success and you can learn from the successes. And secondly, what we're doing at the moment definitely isn't working. It hasn't been working for a very long time. We talked about the regional disparity problem. That's only been getting worse and worse and worse given the centralisation of the state. But most importantly of all, whilst Whitehall is trying to do everything, it can't be strategic. Even if the performance of local government was not particularly strong, it would still be worth doing because it would give Whitehall the space to actually come up with, to actually focus on the things they should be focused on and not get constantly overwhelmed by the detail of trying to run the operational delivery of every service. When you've got a Prime Minister who's trying to personally write his own sort of education policies whilst also dealing with Ukraine and so on, that's where you get a problem.
Absolutely.
There's a lady here and a gentleman just at the back, if we can get another mic to him. Young man just there, yeah, if you just, that's it, perfect.
Anna Moore, Chief Exec, Domina Homes. I want to pick up on logistics and strategy. Even where we have clear strategy, we're failing to deliver, right? 1.5 million new homes, planning consents at a record low. £2 billion a year committed to upgrading our leaking housing. We can't distribute it because of Byzantine grant eligibility, plateaus and cliff edges, and benefits that mean that we're spurting people getting back to work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These things are incredibly important, highly detailed and expert, and also incredibly boring. So how do we generate political will, energy, momentum to solve some of the grit and gum in the system?
We heard
Did you catch any of that?
Yeah, it was perfect. Good, okay. So I like that. I'm going to just note politically boring, but you'll remind me what we mean by that. Young man at the back, yeah.
Hi. I've got a question. It's a slightly contentious one, but this is from Mr. Freedman. To what extent does he think that the era of mass immigration is a cause or a symptom of Britain being described as a failed state by a lot of people?
Really interesting, thank you. And is there one last short question? I think your hand was first. If you've got a quick question, then we might have time for another one. You're just behind you. There's a mic coming up. To
All
you.
right, yeah.
Perfect.
Hi, my name is Colin Sampson. I'm a sociologist and academic. Britain, of course, was an imperial state, and much of its wealth was based on its empire. And I was wondering whether you think this may play out in the future. I mean, already we've seen in the last few decades that there's been a number of calls for reparations. A number of people have called for examining the patrimony that Britain has received from that. And I was wondering whether you think that may shape the future of the British state.
Okay, great. What order should we do that in? Sam, do you want to, this was directly to you, the question of mass immigration, is it a cause or is it a product of what we're seeing now?
I think it's related in several different ways. The first is to the point that Martin's been making, which is about the fact we haven't figured out what our economic model is post-financial crash. And that's meant that we have had an immigration policy that has been, that the actual immigration policy has been totally at odds with the rhetoric around the immigration policy, which has created a massive crisis of trust around the subject. So we have had this constant situation where Prime Ministers, David Cameron in 2010, we're going to reduce below 100,000. Every Prime Minister is promised to reduce immigration. And then the Treasury comes along and says, well, if you do that, we've got an even bigger problem with GDP, we've got an even bigger problem with the economy. So they haven't. And under Boris Johnson, that really took off. I don't think the solution to that is to not have any immigration, because we have a real need for certain skills in our economy. We could have a long debate about what the immigration system should look like, but we need some immigration. But it does point to this problem of the interaction between politics and strategy, and the fact that there simply is no relationship between the two in a lot of areas of policy, what people are saying and what's actually happening.
Martin, do you want to pick up on the sort of the boringness of trying to get policy done?
I was going to comment on the building stuff
Exactly.
and the empire,
Okay, fine.
on which I have strong views. It's pretty obvious, it seems to me, that a necessary condition for growth, which I believe in, is that you can build things.
Yeah.
And we do seem to have very serious problems with building things, of anything. And I've been writing about housing for 20 years, at least. We have the high-speed rail, whatever it is, disaster, I think we can safely say. A lot of analysis, which also appears in Sam's book, which shows that basically we have a wonderful system for preventing people from building anything. I can see all sorts of reasons why that we show it's a densely populated island, blah, blah, blah. But if you can't build things, this comes back to your question, well, you can't build things, and growth requires building stuff. So it's a rather big problem.
Even if AI took the place of
You still need stuff in which places in which things happen, and you certainly, for example, need places in which families can live. One of the obvious profound social malaise is as a result of the fact that we've been building housing much more slowly than our households have grown, predictable given demography, is that we have unbelievable costs of housing for young people, and that has pretty profound social consequences. So these are major problems. I hope this government would fix this, and I'm getting very, very doubtful what will happen. And then the second point is, I'm going to be really controversial because it's fun. I do not believe it is the case that in any significant the argument that Britain became rich because of its empire is, I think, very debatable. The figures are far too small to make sense, because you just couldn't have the scale of resource transfer that would really make a difference. It was a modest help in creating some of the fortunes, but the biggest problem with it is, if Britain had the biggest empire by far, right? So if it is the main reason for our wealth, we should clearly be the richest country in Europe by a pretty long way. Actually, we're one of the poorest. So did Switzerland benefit because of our empire? Should they pay reparations? Germany, because of our empire, should they pay reparations? I think it's completely absurd. But I also think it's not going to become politically live, because there is no way that the countries that are relevant here are going to try and devote vast efforts to squeezing irrelevant amounts of money out of us. And when I talk about the places which will be really relevant, there's only one, India. So the Indian government has other things to worry about. So I think I feel fairly strongly the argument is weak and it's not going to happen.
Lord Richards, I'm going to give you the last word of the night. You
Oh,
can answer
right.
any or all the questions as long as
I
you're
apologise
finished
for
by
not answering
7:30.
other questions.
Well, I'd like to make a sort of Janet and John point, which in a way is quite a useful summary of certainly what I've been trying to get at, which is the issue of strategy, about building. That's a policy. We want to achieve so many things. What I'm focusing on is how you deliver it, and it's a simple message about ends, ways and means. So the government have established the ends, they haven't established the ways, and they certainly haven't got the means. So that is at the heart of flawed strategy, whether it's building strategy, economic strategy, or national strategy. And I think it's not a bad, from my point of view, as the Janet and John of strategy, and I under no illusions how difficult this is, the sort of things that I was trying to get at. So thank you very much for that question.
Thank you very much, all of you, for a brilliant, stimulating debate, and thank you all so much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My presentation, lots of beautiful charts.
There will be a superb follow-up to welcome Martin back to present that presentation, I'm sure. To our wonderful panel, Lord Richards, Martin Wolf, Sam Freedman, thank you very much for your incredible and engaging discussion. To our wonderful moderator, Emily Maitlis, thank you very much on behalf of the University Land Society, the university itself, and obviously the Whitehall Group. Thank you very much for your time this evening. If I can ask you all, if you'd like to join us for a drink at the back, you'd be most welcome. I want to thank especially our hosts this evening, Carter Jonas and Richard Bruce, the CEO, and thank you for hosting us. To our sponsors, Maitland Chambers and Dara Connell, the Business Post, our media partner, and Order Teacher, thank you very much for the support and the engagement. It is invaluable, and we hope to welcome you all back to what will be our 12th Whitehall lecture next year. So on behalf of the university, on behalf of the Whitehall Group, thank you very much, and please join us at the back for a drink. Thank you. If I could just ask Anne